I am 83 years old. My name is Walter Crane. In 1972, I was 51 years old, working as a high school history teacher in Burbank. And my wife, Evelyn, had won 2 tickets to The Tonight Show in a radio contest. She won them on a Tuesday, and we went on a Thursday, and I sat in the 3rd row of that studio and watched something happen that I have thought about almost every week for the past 52 years. I almost didn't go. I had papers to grade and I told Evelyn to take her sister instead. She said she wanted me to come and I said, all right. And I went, and sitting in that 3rd row is the reason I am telling you this story now. I was close enough to see faces, close enough to hear voices when the room went quiet. And the room went quiet several times that night in ways I was not prepared for. This is everything I saw. The Tonight Show in 1972 was what The Tonight Show was in every year Johnny Carson hosted it, which is to say, it was the center of American popular culture on a weeknight in a way that nothing else was. 11 years. Johnny had been doing it by then. And the thing he'd built was not just a television program. It was a specific kind of live event that the country had come to depend on in a way that was hard to articulate, but easy to feel when you were sitting in that studio. 400 people in the audience and however many millions at home, and everybody in the room understanding that whatever happened on that stage happened once and would not happen exactly this way again. Evelyn and I got our seats at 7:45. 3rd row, slightly to the left of center. Good sightline to the couch and the desk. The studio was smaller than I had expected, the way television studios always are when you see them in person for the first time. The familiarity of having watched it on screen, making the actual physical space feel contracted by comparison. The cameras were closer than I expected. The desk was closer. The couch was maybe 30 feet from where I was sitting. I picked up a program from the seat and looked at the guest list. First guest, Angie Dickinson. I recognized the name immediately. Everybody did. Angie Dickinson in 1972 was the kind of famous that belongs to a specific era of American entertainment. The kind of famous that attaches to a woman who has spent 15 years being the smartest and most capable person in any film she is in. While the film's marketing describes her as the most beautiful woman in the room, the kind of famous that comes from Policewoman, which had not yet started, but was in development, and from a long career of films that had made her name and face and manner recognizable to anyone who watched American movies or television with any regularity. She was also in 1972 the undisputed star of anything she appeared on. That was the understanding. Angie Dickinson walked onto a set and the set organized itself around her. She had earned that over 20 years of work, and she knew it. And the people booking her knew it, and the arrangements that got made when she agreed to appear somewhere reflected that understanding implicitly. The second guest slot on the program was listed as a special surprise guest. I looked at that line for a moment and then put the program away. Evelyn was reading hers. She said, "Oh, a surprise guest. That's exciting." I agreed with her. Neither of us knew yet what the surprise was. 57096. The show started at 8:30. Johnny's monologue was good that night, the room already warm from it by the time the first guest was introduced. Johnny had a particular quality in those years of knowing exactly how much energy to put into an entrance, exactly how to set the temperature of a room before a guest walked through the curtain so that the guest arrived into the right conditions rather than having to create them. He said, "My first guest tonight is an actress, a genuine star, a woman who has been one of the most compelling presences in American film for nearly 2 decades. Ladies and gentlemen, Angie Dickinson." She came out and the audience gave her the response that that description had earned. Warm, genuine, the applause of people who recognized someone they had been watching for a long time and were genuinely pleased to see in person. She moved through the curtain with the ease of someone for whom entrances had been managed and practiced over 20 years of public life. And she sat down in the guest chair with the specific composure of a woman who has made herself very comfortable with being looked at. She was 51 years old, the same age I was that year, and she was dressed the way you dressed when you were going to be on Johnny Carson in 1972, which is to say beautifully in a way that acknowledged the cameras without performing for them. She looked like herself, which was the accomplishment. Looking like the version of yourself that people expect while still being recognizably human. Johnny welcomed her and they moved into the conversation with the easy rhythm of two people who had done this before and understood the format. He asked her about what she was working on, about the projects in development, about her perspective on the changes happening in American film in the early 70s. She was articulate and warm and specific. The kind of guest who makes a host look good because she engages with the questions rather than deflecting them. The audience liked her. I liked her. Evelyn liked her. About 12 minutes into the segment, Johnny looked at the camera with the expression I would later learn to recognize as the expression he used when he was about to change the temperature of the room, and he said, "I want to bring out someone who I think is going to make for a very interesting conversation tonight. A guest who has a very different relationship to action and adventure on screen. Someone I think the audience is going to be very pleased to see. Ladies and gentlemen, Bruce Lee." The curtain opened. The response from the audience was immediate and warm. The specific kind of warm that 1972 produced for Bruce Lee in American venues. Not the universal recognition he would have after Enter the Dragon, but the recognition of people who were paying attention to what was happening in entertainment and had already found him through the Green Hornet and Long Street and whatever else had reached them. A portion of the audience was on its feet. The rest was applauding with genuine enthusiasm. He walked out. He moved the way he always moved, which I was seeing for the first time in person, and which was different from how I had processed movement in the context of cameras. On screen, there is always the frame, the edit, the decision about what you see and when. And within all of that, his movement was remarkable. In person, without any of those filters, without the cut to the next shot, watching a man walk from a curtain to a desk in a single continuous movement. The quality of his movement was something I did not have a word for and still don't. Not quite grace, not quite efficiency, something that was both of those things, and also something underneath them that neither word captured. He went to Johnny first, the natural order of a guest arriving at a talk show, and he bowed. It was a small bow, not theatrical, not performed, not the exaggerated stage bow of someone making a cultural statement, a real bow, brief, the bow of one person acknowledging another with the specific kind of respect that his background had taught him. Johnny, who had hosted 11 years of varied guests from every culture and background and understood the gesture immediately for what it was, returned it, a smaller version of the same bow, the bow of a host accepting the gesture in the spirit it was offered. They shook hands. Johnny said something to him that I was too far away to hear. Bruce said something back. They both smiled, the easy smile of two professionals beginning a conversation they expected to be good. Then Bruce turned toward the couch. Angie Dickinson had been watching all of this. I was in the third row and I had a clear sight line to the couch and I had been watching her face since the moment Johnny announced the surprise guest because the response of the first guest to a surprise second guest is always one of the more interesting things to watch on a talk show. The genuine unfiltered reaction happening in real time before the professional composure reasserts itself. What I saw on Angie Dickinson's face when Bruce Lee walked through that curtain was not hostility, not immediately. It was something more complicated and in some ways more interesting than hostility. The expression of a woman who has arrived at an event with a clear understanding of what that event is and who is central to it and who has just watched the terms of the event change in a way that was not communicated to her in advance. The expression of a person who has been surprised by a professional situation and is deciding in real time how to respond to that surprise. She put a version of a smile on her face, a functional smile, the kind that a 20-year professional puts on when the situation requires the appearance of being pleased, even when being pleased is not the primary experience. Bruce walked to the couch. He stopped a few feet from where she was sitting, and he bowed, the same bow he had given Johnny, brief, genuine, the bow of one person acknowledging another with respect. The bow that had Angie Dickinson returned it even minimally in any version would have been a moment that lasted 3 seconds and was forgotten. She did not return it. She looked at him for a moment and then she looked at Johnny. The redirect of someone who has decided that the gesture did not require a response, who has treated it as a thing that happened in the space between two people without choosing to receive it. The room registered this. Not all of the room, not the people in the back rows who couldn't see clear. Why, but the people close enough to see faces, which included me in the third row, registered it in the specific way that rooms register something awkward, which is by going slightly quieter and then slightly louder as the ambient noise adjusts around the space where a response should have been and wasn't. Johnny saw it. I watched his face when it happened, and I saw it register there. A brief flicker of something, not quite alarm, closer to professional recalibration. The instant adjustment of a host who has 11 years of experience handling unexpected moments and who is already calculating how to move forward from this one. Bruce sat down on the couch next to Angie Dickinson. His expression had not changed that I could see from the third row. He looked at Johnny, the easy attention of a man prepared to have a conversation. Johnny said with the specific warmth of someone covering a gap with genuine professionalism, two of the most exciting action stars in the world on the same couch. This is something I've been looking forward to. He began asking Bruce questions about what he was working on, about Jeet Kune Do, about his philosophy of martial arts as he'd been describing it in other venues. Bruce answered clearly and well, the specific combination of concrete detail and accessible philosophy that made him compelling to watch in interviews. The audience was engaged and Angie Dickinson was quiet in a way that was not the quiet of someone listening. It was a particular kind of quiet. The quiet of someone who has a response to what is happening that they have decided for the moment to hold internally. You could see it in the way she was sitting slightly more forward than she had been sitting before Bruce arrived. The posture of someone who is paying careful attention to something they have not yet decided how to respond to publicly. Johnny, with the instinct of someone who understood that having two guests on a couch requires managing both of them, turned to her and said, "Angie, you've been doing action on screen for a long time. Does what Bruce is describing this idea of martial arts as a state of mind rather than just a physical discipline? Does that connect to anything in your experience?" She said, "I think there's something to it." She said it in a tone that communicated she was being polite rather than endorsing the idea with any genuine enthusiasm. Johnny said, "You sound skeptical." She said, "I think any serious physical discipline produces real skill. I have no doubt about that." She looked at Bruce briefly and then at Johnny. "I also think that what gets presented to the public as martial arts expertise and what exists in a real situation are sometimes rather different things." The audience received this. A few murmurs. Bruce said, "That's a fair distinction. The public version of any skill and the real version are often very different." Angie said, "Yes." Then she said something that was not exactly hostile, but was not exactly not hostile. She said, "I'm always curious about the gap between what films present and what reality is. In my experience, the gap is usually larger than the people on the film side of it want to acknowledge." Bruce said, "I agree, which is why I've spent more time on the other side of it than the film side." Johnny said, "Tell us about that. The training, the school, what that's produced." Bruce talked about it. He was clear and specific in the way he was always clear and specific. The years of training, the students who had gone on to compete and win in multiple disciplines, the development of Jeet Kune Do as a system that synthesized what actually worked from many different sources. He talked about it the way someone talks about something they have lived rather than something they are performing knowledge of. And here is where the evening started to shift because as Bruce was talking, I noticed Angie Dickinson's expression change. Not dramatically, not obviously, but I was in the third row, and I had been watching her face since the bow, and I saw what happened to it as Bruce talked. The polite skepticism was still there, but something else had joined it. A kind of sharpening, the expression of someone who has been sitting with something they're not saying and is deciding that the time for not saying it is ending. She waited for a natural pause in what Bruce was saying. Then she said, "I think all of that is impressive." Bruce looked at her. She said, "What I'm less clear on is whether it translates to anything real, whether what can be done in a training hall with students and in a film with choreography and camera angles holds up when those conditions are removed." Bruce said, "What conditions would you like to see it hold up in?" She said, "Real ones." She said, "It's simply not as a challenge exactly, more as a reasonable demand. I've been doing action on screen for a long time. I know what film action looks like, and I know what the gap between film action and real physical competence looks like, and I'm curious which side of that gap we're actually on here. Conti, if you think that was the sharpest thing she said in the first segment. What came about 90 seconds later made it sound like a pleasantry. Johnny said, I think what Bruce has been describing is a system that has been tested in ways that go well beyond the film work. Angie said, I'm not talking about the system. I'm talking about the person. Systems are what people describe. What I'm asking about is what the person in front of me can actually do as opposed to what the person in front of me can describe. The room shifted. I felt it from the third row. The specific atmospheric change of a studio when something has been said that everyone present has understood is pointed in a way that previous things were not. Bruce said, what would you like me to demonstrate? She said, I wouldn't ask you to demonstrate anything. I'm simply making an observation about the difference between talking about skill and having it. Bruce said, the observation implies you have a view about which side of that difference I'm on. She said, I have a view about the gap between what gets packaged and presented as martial arts expertise for American audiences and what exists when you take away the packaging. Bruce said, and your view is that I'm the packaging. She looked at him. She said, I think the honest version of the answer to that question is, I don't know. What I've seen is films and interviews. What I haven't seen is anything that would allow me to form a confident opinion about what's actually there. Bruce said, that's honest. She said, I try to be. He said, then let me be honest, too. What's actually there is 20 years of daily training, students who have won professional competitions across multiple disciplines, a system that has been developed through real contact with real resistance over a long period of time. That's what's there. Whether you've seen it is a separate question from whether it exists. She said, I don't doubt that something is there. I doubt that what's been presented is an accurate representation of what's there. Johnny said, I think we're getting into some interesting territory here in the voice of a man who is trying to find the positive frame for what is becoming a difficult conversation. Angie said, I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm saying something I actually think. The martial arts phenomenon in American entertainment right now is partly genuine expertise and partly a great deal of mystique and packaging that gets accepted without scrutiny because the visual presentation is impressive. And I think it's worth asking the question of which part we're dealing with in any specific case. Bruce said, and when you look at me specifically, what do you think you're dealing with? She paused. I watched her pause from the third row. The pause of someone deciding how far to go. Then she said, I think you're very convincing, which is not the same answer as the one you're hoping for. The room went quiet the way a room goes quiet when something precise has landed in a way that was both sharp and fair enough to be difficult to respond to simply. Bruce looked at her. He said, convincing means what you're seeing reads as real. She said, convincing means what you're seeing looks real. Those are different things. He said, you've spent 2 decades making things look real. You know what that requires. She said, I do, which is exactly why I'm asking the question. Johnny said with the specific energy of someone who has decided the moment requires intervention. Let's take a quick break and come back to this very interesting conversation. The on-air light dropped, and what happened in the next 90 seconds of commercial break was something I watched from the third row with the full attention of someone who understands they are watching something that will not look like this again. Johnny was off his desk before the transition finished. He went to the couch to Angie specifically, and he spoke to her in a low voice with the body language of a host who is asking something rather than telling something. The specific body language of a man who has built 30 years of a career on not making his guests feel managed even when he is managing them carefully. Angie listened to him. She said something back. Her expression was not the expression of someone who is being persuaded. It was the expression of someone who is being spoken to and has decided to let it happen without changing anything about what they intend to do next. Johnny looked at Bruce. Bruce looked at Johnny. Something passed between them that I was not close enough to read precisely, but the quality of it from the third row was the quality of 2 people who have understood each other without requiring more words. Fred Dordova came onto the floor from the production area and had a brief conversation with the segment producer who was standing near camera 2. I watched their faces rather than their words. The faces of people who are managing something. Evelyn leaned over to me during the break and said, "Is this going the way I think it's going?" I said, "I thought it was." She said, "She doesn't like that he's here." I said, "I thought that was right, but I thought it was more specific than that." I thought she had arrived as the action star, the woman who had spent 2 decades defining what it meant to be a woman doing physical and dangerous work on American screens. And she had been presented with a surprise second guest who was being framed as a parallel thing, as another version of the same idea, and she had not agreed to be placed in a category with someone she had not chosen to be in a category with, and she was saying so. Evelyn thought about this for a moment, then she said, "That's more complicated." I said yes. The on-air light came back on. Johnny came back to his desk with the composure of a man who has decided on his strategy for the next segment and is executing it with the professional certainty that 11 years of live television provides. He looked at both of his guests and he said, "We were having a very frank conversation before the break about the relationship between what gets presented as martial arts expertise and what's actually there. I want to give both of you the chance to say what you actually think." He looked at Angie first. She said, "What I actually think is something I've been saying. I think the martial arts presentation that American audiences have been receiving is partly real and partly a very successful construction, and I think the construction works because audiences don't have the background to distinguish between them. I'm not saying that about Bruce specifically. I'm saying it about the phenomenon." Johnny said, Bruce said, "I appreciate the distinction and I want to address the specific version of it that applies to me. The construction you're describing exists. I've seen it. I've been frustrated by it. Films that use martial arts as visual decoration without understanding or representing what's actually there. What I've tried to do is something different. Whether I've succeeded is a fair question, but the effort has been toward accuracy rather than packaging." Angie said, "That's the right answer." Bruce said, but she looked at him. He said, "There's something else you're saying that isn't about the phenomenon in general." She was quiet for a moment. He said, "You're saying something about why you find it difficult that I'm on this couch tonight." The room went very still. Johnny held completely still. The specific stillness of a host who has been in the middle of something and has just watched it move somewhere more honest and more specific than he was anticipating, and who has decided that the right response is to not interfere. Angie said, "I don't have any difficulty with you being on this couch." Bruce said, "I think you do." She said, "I think that's presumptuous." He said, "You were the first guest tonight. You have a long career of serious work and action. You've spent 20 years being one of the few women in that space and doing it at a level that doesn't get acknowledged the way it should. And you arrived here tonight to talk about that work, and I walked through a curtain and the conversation shifted. I think that's what you're responding to." The silence in that studio was the most complete silence I have heard in any public space in my life. The kind that doesn't happen by accident. That requires 400 people to all be doing the same thing at the same time, which was holding their breath. Angie Dickinson looked at Bruce Lee. She looked at him. The way you look at someone who has just said something true about you that you were not expecting them to be able to see. And her expression went through something in the space of 3 or 4 seconds that was private and complicated and visible to everyone in the room who was paying attention. Then she said, "That's perceptive." He said, "It's observation." She said, "You're right that I was the first guest and I have a body of work I came here to discuss, and when the conversation shifted toward you, toward martial arts, toward a comparison of different kinds of physical expertise, I found it." She stopped. She was choosing the word carefully. She said, "Reductive?" He said, "Reductive? How?" She said, "Because the frame that gets set up when you're asked to compare what I do with what you do implies that they're the same kind of thing. And they're not the same kind of thing. What I've done is build a career over 20 years in a field that didn't particularly want me in it. Doing work that was more serious and more capable than the roles I was offered allowed me to fully show and creating space for a specific kind of woman to exist in American film. That's not comparable to martial arts expertise. It's a different category of thing. And framing them as two versions of the same thing. Two action stars, two people who do physical things on screen takes something from what I've done and reduces it. The room breathed, not all at once, gradually the slow exhale of 400 people who have been holding something and have been given permission to release it because what was just said was true and complete in a way that had not required any further escalation to produce. Bruce said, "I agree with everything you just said." She looked at him. He said, "What you've built is its own thing. I should not have been placed in a frame with you as though we're the same kind of thing because we're not. You've done something I haven't done and can't do, which is be the version of yourself you've described in the environment you've described it in. That took 20 years, and it was not a parallel path to mine. I don't think the producers thought carefully enough about what they were doing when they put us on the same couch as a comparison." Angie said, "No, I don't think they did." A small laugh from somewhere in the audience. Not unkind. The laugh of people who recognize when the honest version of a thing has finally been said, Johnny said in a voice that was quieter than his normal register. "For what it's worth, I'm sitting here and I think I understand now why the last 20 minutes went the way they did. And I think both of you just said something more interesting than anything I had planned for this segment." Angie looked at Bruce. Something had shifted in her face. Not softened, that's not the right word, clarified. The complicated expression that had been there since the curtain opened had resolved into something simpler and more direct. The expression of someone who has said what they needed to say and has heard something back that they didn't expect to hear. "She said the ball when you arrived." He waited. "She said I didn't return it." He said no. "She said I want to say something about that." He said all right. "She said it was not about you, not about who you are or what you've done. It was about arriving in a situation I hadn't been prepared for. In which my place had been changed without my knowledge and responding to that with something I'm not proud of." She paused. "That was unfair to you. It was the wrong response to the right frustration." Bruce said, "The frustration was legitimate." She said, "The way I expressed it wasn't." He said, "You're expressing it now. That's better." The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Angie Dickinson did something that I was not expecting and that I will remember for the rest of my life. She extended her hand, not the handshake of a business introduction. The extended hand of a person who is initiating something, offering something, the gesture of someone who has decided that the conversation they've had and the ground they've covered together in the last 20 minutes has earned an acknowledgement of a different kind. Bruce took her hand. They held the handshake for a moment that was slightly longer than a handshake usually lasts. The length that makes a handshake mean something rather than just function as a greeting or a closing. Then Bruce Lee did something else. He bowed small, brief, the same bow he had given when he arrived. And this time Angie Dickinson returned it, not deeply, not with any performance of it, just a small inclination of her head, the acknowledgement of a gesture that had been offered and was now being received. The audience produced a sound, not applause, not a cheer, something more organic than either of those. The sound of 400 people exhaling a collective breath they hadn't realized they were holding. Johnny looked at the camera. He looked at it for a long moment without saying anything. Then he said, "I have been doing this show for 11 years. I have sat at this desk with 400 guests. I have watched a lot of conversations happen on this stage and I want to tell you right now from experience that what just happened is the rarest thing that happens on live television, which is that two people told each other the truth." The audience applauded. Real applause. The kind that starts from a genuine place rather than a prompted one. Johnny said, "Angie, I want to come back to you because I think we owe you the conversation you came here to have. Tell me about what you're working on." And she did. The last 10 minutes of the segment were the segment she had been prepared to have, the conversation about her work and her career and the projects developing. And she talked about it with the ease of someone who has set something down and can now focus on the thing she came to focus on. She was better in those 10 minutes than she had been in the first 15, more specific, more alive to the conversation, less contained. Bruce listened with the complete attention he gave to everything. At one point, Johnny asked him something about how he thought about the public version of what he did versus the private reality of it. And his answer was brief and clear. And it was also, I thought, an answer that was partly about what Angie had said, about the gap between presentation and reality, about how he understood his own relationship to that gap. The show wrapped, Johnny said his closing things. The credits rolled. Evelyn and I stayed in our seats for a few minutes after the audience began filing out. The way you sometimes stay in your seat after a film that has done something to you, and you're not quite ready to return to the regular world. The people around us were already talking. The specific animated conversation of people who have just watched something that they know was real. The man in the seat next to me, who I had not spoken to all evening, turned and said, "Did you see the bow at the end?" I said, "Yes." He said, "First time I've seen something like that happen on this show." I said, "I thought it was probably the first time it had happened anywhere." He thought about that for a moment. Then he nodded. The slow nod of someone agreeing with something that has just been put into words. They couldn't have found themselves. Evelyn and I walked out into the Burbank night and we drove home mostly in the particular quiet that comes after an experience that needs some time to settle before it can be fully talked about. At some point during the drive, she said she was right, you know, about what they did to her segment. I said yes, she said, and he was right about why she was angry. I said yes, she said, and then they sorted it out. I said yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm glad you came instead of sitting home with your papers." I said, "I was too." I have been a high school history teacher and then a retired high school history teacher for a long time now. And one of the things you learn teaching history is that the moments that matter are rarely the ones that announce themselves as mattering in advance. They often look like ordinary evenings, ordinary gatherings, ordinary conversations that no one has identified in advance as significant. You learn to watch everything because you don't know in advance which things will still be in your head 50 years later. I am 83 years old. I have been carrying that studio around with me for 52 years. Not just the bow at the end, though the bow is what I think about most. Also the bow at the beginning, the one that wasn't returned. Also the 12 minutes in the middle where something complicated and honest was worked out in public by two people who were both right about what they were saying. Also, Angie Dickinson's face when she understood that Bruce Lee had seen something in the situation that she hadn't expected him to see. What I've thought about most across 52 years is the moment when he said, "You were the first guest tonight. You have a long career of serious work in action. You spent 20 years being one of the few women in that space and you arrived here to talk about that work," and I walked through a curtain and the conversation shifted. He had been in the room for maybe 20 minutes when he said that. He had been sitting next to her for 20 minutes and watching and listening. And he had understood something about the situation that required seeing it from her perspective rather than his own. He had understood what the bow not being returned was actually about, which was not about him. That's the thing I keep coming back to. He understood what it was not about. And understanding what something is not about is harder than it sounds, harder than understanding what something is about. Because understanding what something is not about requires setting aside your own position in the situation entirely and looking at it from somewhere else. He did that in 20 minutes in a television studio in real time with 400 people watching. I don't know what that takes. I only know I watched it happen from the third row and I have been thinking about it since 1972 and I am still not done thinking about it. Bruce Lee died 4 months after that evening. He was 32 years old. I heard the news in the morning and I went to school and I taught 3 classes and I drove home and I sat in the kitchen for a while. Evelyn came in and said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "Bruce Lee died." She said, "The man from the show?" I said, "Yes." She sat down across from me. Neither of us said anything for a while. Then she said, he would have been something. I said, he already was something. She said, yes, she knew that. She meant something different, something beyond what he'd already been. I said, yes, I knew what she meant. We sat there for a while longer. That was 52 years ago. I still teach sometimes private students now, history, and occasionally other things. I still think about that evening more than I think about most evenings from my life. I am 83 years old, and the number of evenings I have clear memories of is smaller than you'd think. The years compress and blur, and what remains is what was real enough and specific enough to survive the compression. That evening survived the third row. Evelyn's hand on my arm during the break. The quiet when Bruce said what he said about the curtain and the conversation shifting. The bow at the beginning that wasn't returned. The bow at the end that was. I was there. This is what I saw.